Welcome to the Daily Voice Podcast, and today's podcast title is Heads Up, Tails Down. And you might be thinking, what's happening today? Well, we're reading from the Old King James, and our passage is Psalms 35, verse 12. They rewarded me evil for good to the spoiling of my soul. And this is a really interesting passage of scripture because the word good here means, in the original Hebrew, it means the higher life. So often we look at humans, our fellow human beings, in other words, somebody else, for a higher kind of life. We look at our spouses for a higher kind of life. We look at our bosses, our business partners, our customers, our fellow employees, or just society in general for a higher kind of life. And here David writes this psalm in Psalms 35, and he says, I put my best foot forward. And in the process, the so-called proverbial they, which I thought was going to give me a higher life, just gave me evil, just made me miserable. And he uses these words. They spoiled my soul. They made my life just absolutely miserable. Now, this is what happens, folks, when we put our trust in people and we try to access this so-called proverbial higher life from another fellow human being. We're going to not live a life of heads up, tails down. In other words, we then live a life of heads down, tails up. And life then is just simply upside down. That's what he is getting to in this passage of scripture. He says, now my life is just totally spoiled. My life is upside down because I depended on someone to give me access to a higher life, but instead I got a raw deal. Now, how many of us know that sometimes you get a raw business deal, you get a raw deal in the hand of marriage, you get a raw deal in a family situation, you get a raw deal in society in general. It may be bad politics in your country, but nevertheless, the light at the end of the tunnel comes here in verse 27, where he says, but I am, despite all of this, I'm just so glad that my God delights in the prosperity of his servant. Now, what is he saying? Is he said that if I make this higher life dependent on if I make the higher life dependent on a higher power, which is God, I will not get the raw deal. So be encouraged. Let's live heads up, tail down. Look at your God for the higher life. Do not look at your fellow man or your neighbor for the higher life. They are just human. So come on, heads up, tail down. Be blessed.